Hey guys, tonight we step back into a world where robes, crowns, and whispered prayers mingle with political intrigue, ambition, and a surprisingly generous helping of chaos. Picture yourself in early medieval Rome, wandering through narrow, uneven streets dusted with the remnants of a once mighty empire. The air is thick with the scent of stone and smoke from nearby hearths. You catch distant echoes of chanting priests blending with the clatter of merchants unloading goods. The idea of the Pope, that towering spiritual figure, is only just beginning to take shape here. But don't let that fool you. The path to papal power is anything but straightforward. You probably won't survive this without a few raised eyebrows and a growing sense that church history might be the wildest soap opera you never signed up for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening. I'm curious how far and wide this bedtime history is traveling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you are walking along the ancient cobblestones of Rome sometime in the 5th century, right after the Western Roman Empire has officially fallen. The imperial pomp is gone, but the echoes of empire linger in cracked marble and crumbling temples. Here, in the midst of political chaos, the Bishop of Rome, the man we'd eventually call the Pope, begins to stake out a new kind of authority. But this role is far from clear-cut. The title Pope, for example, was not exclusively tied to the Bishop of Rome yet, it was a term of endearment applied to various senior bishops across the Christian world. It would take centuries before the Bishop of Rome was universally acknowledged as the supreme pontiff. In fact, in these early centuries, the Pope's authority was tangled up in a mess of theological debates, power struggles with emperors, and local rivalries. The Church was still figuring out how to define itself. The Bishop of Rome claimed a special status based on the belief that he was the spiritual heir to Saint Peter, the apostle who, according to tradition, held the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This claim gradually elevated the Roman bishop above other Christian leaders, but it wasn't an uncontested rise. Picture Pope Leo I, known as Leo the Great, standing firm in 452 when the terrifying Attila the Hun approaches Rome, the city trembling at the prospect of destruction. Legend says Leo personally met with Attila and convinced him to spare the city. Historians still argue whether this was a masterstroke of diplomacy or just fortunate timing as Attila's own supply issues forced a retreat. Either way, this event bolstered the Pope's image as not just a spiritual shepherd but a protector of Rome itself, marking a turning point in the papal role from purely religious leader to political figure. But not every pope was so dignified. The early centuries of the papacy were riddled with intrigue, sometimes descending into outright farce. Rival factions within the church sometimes appointed competing popes simultaneously, turning the leadership into a contested prize rather than a settled office. Imagine a church divided like a medieval reality show. With backroom deals, power plays, and occasionally, violence. These chaotic episodes blurred the lines between spiritual leadership and political maneuvering. And then there's the delightful practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, which reared its ugly head even in these formative years. Far from being a problem exclusive to the later, more decadent medieval period, simony was reportedly common by the 4th and 5th centuries. Imagine aspiring to be pope and having to cough up a bribe to secure the office. It's a humbling reminder that the papacy's spiritual mission often got tangled in worldly ambition and financial machinations. At the same time, these early popes were attempting to define church doctrine and combat heresies, a task complicated by the diversity of belief sprouting up across the vast Christian world. You could say the early church was still in its teenage rebellion phase, with competing factions arguing over everything from the nature of Christ to the role of women in the church. The popes acted as referees but often had to pick sides, sometimes alienating large groups of followers. Historians still argue whether this process of doctrinal consolidation strengthened the church's unity or sowed seeds of future divisions. despite all this chaos, the papacy gradually became a symbol of stability. Rome's spiritual significance outlasted its political might, offering a thread of continuity amid the crumbling Western Empire. The Pope began to accumulate not just spiritual authority but also temporal power, including vast landholdings known as the Papal States. This melding of religious and political power set the stage for centuries of complex relationships between popes and kings, emperors, and later, even nation-states. A quirky tidbit for your mental cabinet: in those early centuries, some popes were more warrior than cleric. Pope Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great, reportedly organized defenses against invading Lombards and even funded armies from church coffers. So, the Pope's role wasn't just about prayers and sermons but also about swords and shields. Long before we think of popes in robes and mitres, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen later medieval popes tried? Well, the early popes had their own set of weird and sometimes desperate survival tools. Their main challenge was keeping Rome safe and the Church intact amid waves of invasions, internal strife, and political gamesmanship. The papal throne was hardly a cushy armchair but a precarious perch, with some popes serving only brief, turbulent terms before being deposed or worse. As you settle into sleep, think about the irony: the papacy's roots are less like a serene garden of faith and more like a wild jungle gym of power struggles, spiritual debates, political alliances, and a dash of scandal. The early popes, far from being infallible spiritual guides, were often deeply human, flawed, ambitious, sometimes ruthless, and sometimes just trying to keep their heads above water. So, as you drift off, remember this: the next time someone tells you history is boring, remind them that the very office of the Pope began with more drama and confusion than a reality TV reunion special. These early centuries set the stage for everything that followed, for better or worse, and proved that even the holiest offices can have the messiest beginnings. You trudge forward through the shadowed corridors of medieval Rome, the faint flicker of candlelight casting long, restless shadows on the cold, uneven stone walls. The air is thick with the mingled scent of incense, damp stone, and centuries-old secrets, and somewhere distant, a bell tolls erratically, like a warning from the past. It is the 10th century, a time when the papal throne is no longer the lofty seat of sanctity you might expect, but a prize in a ruthless power game, where bloodlines and brazen ambition rule far more than prayers or piety. You probably won't survive this chapter without feeling a bit scandalized yourself, and maybe questioning just how holy the Holy Office really was back then. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who else is wide awake or already halfway to dreamland listening in on these wild tales of history's worst popes. Now, imagine the city of Rome back then, no glossy postcard but a chaotic, crumbling metropolis where families fight tooth and nail for control, and the Church's sacred office is no exception. This is the infamous era historians call the pornocracy, or sometimes, more bluntly, the rule of the harlots. It's a nickname that definitely raises eyebrows and invites a raised eyebrow or two from modern sensibilities. The term points to the overwhelming influence of certain Roman noblewomen, especially Theodora and her daughter Marozia, whose grasp on the papacy was so firm it resembled a dynastic monarchy more than a spiritual institution. Picture Marozia, a woman both feared and admired, moving through Rome's power circles like a chess master, placing pawns and queens across the board to suit her family's ambitions. She was more than just a noblewoman, she was the real power behind the papal throne, and her influence was so pervasive that she managed to have her own son, John XII, crowned pope when he was still a teenager. Yes, a teenager. Imagine the wild parties, the reckless decisions, and the youthful arrogance wrapped up in the robes of St. Peter's successor. John XII's papacy was a roller coaster of scandal, described by contemporaries as a period filled with excess and debauchery. Stories, some historians believe exaggerated by his enemies, tell of him throwing wild parties, indulging in lustful excess, and even committing acts so sacrilegious that they made the hairs stand up on the necks of church officials. Among these lurid tales are accusations of murder, simony, and sacrilege that paint a picture of a pope more like a corrupt teenage aristocrat than a spiritual shepherd. Historians still argue whether John's reputation was a smear campaign by political rivals or a true reflection of his reign of excess, but either way, it's a vivid example of how badly the papacy's image had deteriorated. But the story doesn't stop with John XII. His mother Marozia and grandmother Theodora essentially ran Rome's political and religious scene like a family business. Controlling appointments, brokering alliances, and manipulating the city's factions with calculated precision. The papal court was less a sanctuary of faith and more a den of intrigue, where spiritual duties were overshadowed by power plays and family rivalries. Theodora and Marozia's influence was so profound that the papacy came to resemble a hereditary monarchy rather than an elected spiritual office. This era is a sharp departure from the idealized image of popes as humble servants of God. One quirky fact about this time is that some popes, including John XII, reportedly employed mercenary soldiers not just to defend the city but to intimidate political rivals and enforce their will. Imagine the Pope's personal guard as a medieval version of hired muscle, blurring the lines between holy leadership and street-level enforcement. This wasn't just about spiritual authority anymore, it was about physical power backed by swords and daggers. Not exactly the choirboy image many might expect, the period also saw the rise of antipopes, rival claimants to the papal throne, often installed by competing political factions or secular rulers. These antipopes splintered loyalties across Christendom and led to schisms that would echo for decades. The rivalry between official popes and antipopes was sometimes less about theology and more about who held the reins of power in Rome. Historians still argue whether these antipopes had any genuine theological legitimacy or were simply pawns in a greater political chess match. Amidst all this turmoil, Rome's spiritual influence was waning, and the general population grew cynical and disillusioned. The pornocracy period severely damaged the papacy's moral authority, making it clear that the Church's leadership was vulnerable to worldly corruption and familial ambition. Yet, ironically, this dark chapter set the stage for reform. The chaos and scandal called for a reckoning, eventually leading to efforts by later popes like Gregory VII to wrest control back from secular powers and cleanse the Church of its excesses. Think of it as a cosmic reset button, triggered by decades of messy, human failings. The papacy's fall from grace during the pornocracy was dramatic and public. But it also proved that even the most sacred institutions could be shaken to their core and forced to rebuild stronger. So, as you let your eyes grow heavier and your breath slow, picture this: the papal office, caught in the grip of an ambitious dynasty, transformed from a spiritual beacon to a gladiator arena of intrigue, lust, and raw power. And remember that teenage Pope John XII, wild and reckless, a reminder that even the holiest offices have had their most unholy moments. Sleep on that thought. History is rarely tidy but always deeply human. You slip even deeper into the tangled, thorny thicket of history, stepping back to the early 11th century, a time when the papacy remained very much a political prize fought over by powerful families and factions. The so-called pornocracy period had finally faded into memory, yet its shadow still stretched long across Rome's streets and halls. The city itself remained a place where spiritual office and temporal power were dangerously, and often scandalously, intertwined. You might assume that by this point, the popes would have learned their lessons about mixing sacred duties with worldly ambitions. Spoiler alert, they absolutely had not. Enter Pope Benedict IX, a name that may sound almost innocuous at first, but belongs to one of the most infamous, outrageous, and scandal-ridden figures ever to wear the papal tiara. Imagine a man who became pope not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, his papacy spinning like a revolving door that seems more fit for a soap opera than the solemn history of the Church. Benedict IX was a scion of the powerful Tusculani family, a dynasty whose influence over Rome and the papacy was immense and often ruthless. He ascended to the papal throne in his early 20s, some historians even speculate he may have been younger, though his exact age remains debated to this day. From the very start, the young pope's behavior rapidly spiraled into a chaotic combination of scandal, excess, and shocking audacity that would forever stain the papal legacy. Benedict IX's reign is widely regarded as one of the absolute lowest points in the entire history of the papacy. Contemporary chroniclers did not hold back in their condemnation, portraying him as a man consumed by wild parties, immoral conduct, and a staggering lack of reverence for the sacred office he held. Rumors flew thick and fast that he turned the Lateran Palace, the papal residence, into little more than a brothel. It was said that he squandered church wealth on his own lavish indulgences, and that his name was tied to everything from bribery to murder plots. While some modern historians caution that certain accounts may be exaggerated or the result of political slander by his enemies, the overall consensus remains that Benedict IX's papacy was catastrophic for the reputation and moral authority of the Church. What is truly bizarre and worthy of an entire late-night history podcast episode all by itself is Benedict IX's astonishing decision to sell the papacy outright. Yes, you read that correctly. At one point, Benedict actually resigned from the papal office and sold it to his godfather, Pope Gregory VI. This extraordinary transaction is often cited as one of the earliest and most blatant instances of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, a practice that was one of the most vehemently condemned abuses in medieval Christendom. Imagine the staggering nerve and audacity it took to treat what was supposed to be the highest spiritual office in the Christian world as if it were a mere commodity to be bought and sold like a piece of property. But the drama surrounding Benedict IX did not end with his sale of the papacy. Instead, it only became more tangled and chaotic. Benedict returned repeatedly to reclaim the papal throne, sometimes by force, creating a bewildering and surreal cycle of resignations, comebacks, and violent power struggles that threw the Church into utter chaos. The people of Rome, witnessing these endless twists and turns, must have been completely exasperated. If the city itself could roll its eyes, it certainly would have done so. One particularly quirky detail that rarely finds its way into standard history textbooks is the rumor that Benedict IX actually married a woman while serving as pope. Given the vow of celibacy expected of clergy, this alone was scandalous enough to shock the medieval world. Even more shocking were reports that he openly kept mistresses and flaunted them about the Vatican, treating the sacred seat of St. Peter almost like his personal playground. Of course, whether these stories are entirely factual or partly the result of political propaganda remains a subject of heated debate among scholars. Many historians continue to argue whether Benedict's conduct was simply the result of outright personal corruption or whether it reflected the broader systemic decay caused by the Church's intense political entanglements during this troubled era. The chaotic saga of Benedict IX also brought into sharp focus the fraught, often hostile relationship between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. Secular rulers frequently viewed the papacy as a tool to extend and legitimize their own political power. Benedict's scandalous misrule was an embarrassment that many of these rulers sought to end by imposing their own favored candidates on the papal throne. This ongoing tug of war between imperial ambitions and papal authority set the stage for a century and more of bitter conflicts that shaped the political and religious landscape of medieval Europe for generations. This turbulent period also saw the troubling introduction of the concept of antipopes in a dramatic and confusing fashion. Benedict IX's multiple comebacks led to rival claimants competing simultaneously for the papal throne, bewildering the faithful and severely undermining the authority of the Church. This was not simply a crisis of faith but a profound political and social upheaval that shook the very foundations of Christendom. Among the many theories that attempt to explain Benedict IX's extraordinary behavior is a fringe but fascinating suggestion that he may have suffered from some form of mental illness or extreme narcissism. His erratic actions and outrageous decisions certainly provide fertile ground for such speculation. While diagnosing historical figures with modern psychological concepts is always fraught with difficulties, this perspective adds an intriguing layer of complexity when trying to understand how a man so evidently unsuited for the role could rise and maintain power repeatedly. Was Benedict merely a product of a corrupt and decadent environment, or was there something fundamentally wrong beneath the surface? Historians continue to debate these questions without reaching definitive conclusions. By the time Benedict IX's tumultuous and scandalous career finally drew to a close, the Church was in desperate need of reform and renewal. It cried out for leaders who could restore dignity, order, and spiritual focus to the papacy. His reign of excess and disgrace was an unmistakable signal that sweeping changes were necessary if the Church was to survive and regain the moral authority it had so grievously lost. So, as you settle down into your bed, imagining the chaotic streets of 11th century Rome, the endless intrigues, the scandalous dramas, and the almost absurd spectacle of a papacy turned into a revolving door of power and corruption, think of Benedict IX as the Pope who not only lost the sacred office but also transformed it into a never-ending carousel of scandal and political machinations. It is a wild and sobering reminder that even the holiest offices have their darkest low points, and that history, much like sleep itself, can be messy, unpredictable, and filled with unexpected surprises. You find yourself drifting deeper into the 12th century, a time when the image of the Church remained heavily bruised and battered from the outrageous antics of popes like Benedict IX. The papacy, an institution that was meant to embody spiritual purity and offer divine guidance to the faithful, was increasingly entangled in worldly politics, and not always in ways that reflected well on its sacred mission. The Church was struggling to maintain its moral authority while its leaders often seemed distracted by personal ambition and earthly power. Your next stop in this turbulent journey through history is the infamous Pope John XII, a man whose papacy reads like a dramatic historical thriller filled with lust, betrayal, and outright debauchery. John XII ascended to the papal throne in the year 955, reportedly at the shockingly young age of just 18. Imagine a mere teenager suddenly thrust into one of the most powerful religious positions in the entire world. He was expected to lead millions of Christians in faith, shepherding them spiritually while also navigating the perilous and complex waters of medieval politics. Spoiler alert, things did not go well. This was a pope who seemed far more interested in pursuing personal pleasures and consolidating his power than in providing genuine spiritual leadership or guidance. Contemporary accounts from chroniclers of the time paint a vivid and disturbing picture of John XII as a man who utterly abandoned the decorum and discipline expected of his office, particularly the vow of celibacy. According to these historical sources, John XII transformed the Lateran Palace, the official papal residence, into a venue for wild and excessive parties where debauchery was the order of the day. It is said that he maintained a large stable of mistresses, indulged in heavy and excessive drinking, and even engaged in violent brawls within the palace walls. Imagine a pope who might have been far more at home in a tavern filled with rowdy commoners than in the sacred confines of a cathedral or basilica. The full extent of his escapades might shock even the most seasoned historians, but fortunately for you, we will keep this narrative relatively suitable for a general audience tonight. One of the most bizarre and significant episodes in John XII's papacy involved his blatant and reckless political opportunism. He famously crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor, an act that should have symbolized unity and mutual respect between the Church and Empire. However, John's loyalty quickly proved to be unreliable as he later conspired against the very emperor he had crowned. This dramatic shift in allegiance sparked a serious crisis that ultimately led Otto to convene a church synod with the aim of addressing John XII's misconduct. This synod went so far as to formally depose John XII from the papal office, accusing him of a staggering laundry list of crimes ranging from sacrilege and simony to adultery and even murder. Whether all of these accusations were entirely justified or were exaggerated and politically motivated by John's enemies remains a matter of heated debate among historians. The political motivations behind his deposition certainly make it difficult to see the full picture clearly. Here comes a quirky and somewhat darkly comedic detail, according to some accounts. John XII once invited a group of noblewomen to a grand feast in the Lateran Palace only to later surprise them with the sudden and unexpected arrival of his own soldiers. This event reportedly led to chaos and humiliation for those present. It sounds like a story ripped straight from a dark comedy or a medieval farce, yet it perfectly illustrates the Pope's reckless and blatant disregard for the dignity and sanctity of his office. Such behavior was not just scandalous but openly disrespectful toward the Church and its followers. Another strange and mysterious twist in John XII's dramatic tale concerns the circumstances surrounding his death. His end remains shrouded in mystery and scandal to this very day. According to popular legend, John XII was killed while trying to flee from a jealous husband who had caught him in flagrante delicto with the wife. The enraged spouse reportedly struck the Pope down, bringing his tumultuous life to a dramatic and violent close. It is an ending that seems almost fitting for a Pope whose life was marked by scandal, excess, and reckless abandon. Scholars continue to debate whether this tale is based on fact or if it was merely an elaborate piece of church propaganda crafted to further tarnish John XII's already infamous memory. John XII's reign stands as an extreme example of the deep corruption and moral decay that plagued the papacy before the sweeping reforms of later centuries sought to restore order and spirituality. His papacy presents a stark contrast to the spiritual ideals that the Church officially sought to uphold. It reveals a side of medieval religious leadership that is often glossed over or softened in more sanctified or romanticized narratives. The complex interplay between John XII's personal misconduct and the broader political struggles of his era exemplifies how the papacy had become far less about holiness and spiritual leadership. Instead, it often revolved around the pursuit and exercise of power, power that could be gained, lost, and violently contested in a volatile and dangerous dance among emperors, nobles, and clergy alike. As you slowly sink further into the realm of sleep, picture the drama-filled halls of the Lateran Palace during John XII's reign, where the heady scent of burning incense mingled with the raucous laughter and loud music of wild, unruly parties. Picture a place where the fate of all Christendom teetered precariously on the whims of a reckless and impulsive teenager who cared more for earthly pleasures than heavenly responsibilities. It serves as a potent and sobering reminder that history's most powerful figures are often deeply flawed and all too human, wrestling with the same temptations and ambitions that challenge people across the centuries, including ourselves. You now drift into the shadowy corridors of the late 13th century, a period when the papacy had evolved beyond being simply a spiritual authority and had transformed into a political titan of immense influence. This was a time when the Pope's power rivaled that of kings and emperors alike, shaping the fate of entire nations. Within this grand and turbulent stage, you encounter Pope Boniface VIII, a towering figure whose ambition, fierce temperament, and unapologetic confidence carved a legacy that remains as fiery and controversial as it is unforgettable. He ascended to the papal throne in 1294, entering the scene with the unmistakable swagger and certainty of a man who firmly believed the Pope was not merely the leader of the Church but, in fact, the ultimate ruler on earth, holding supreme authority over both spiritual and temporal realms. Boniface VIII's reign is most famously marked by his uncompromising and strident assertion of papal supremacy. This was powerfully encapsulated in his 1302 papal bull, Unam Sanctum, a document that boldly declared it to be absolutely necessary for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff in order to attain salvation. Imagine a medieval power play so audacious and far-reaching that it practically dared kings, emperors, and all secular authorities to challenge the Pope's absolute authority. One might say he elevated the concept of the buck stops here to an entirely new and almost divine level. Emphasizing that all earthly power and loyalty must ultimately funnel through his office, with no exceptions or compromises, his papacy is equally notorious for the fierce conflicts it sparked with secular rulers, most notably with King Philip IV of France. Philip was a monarch who was just as determined as Boniface to assert his own sovereign power, unwilling to bow to any external authority, even that of the Pope. Their escalating feud reached a dramatic and violent climax in 1303 with a shocking event known to history as the Outrage of Anagni. During this confrontation, agents loyal to King Philip stormed the papal palace in the town of Anagni and physically assaulted Pope Boniface. This brazen act of aggression against the leader of Christendom sent shockwaves throughout the medieval world and starkly exposed the vulnerabilities and limits of the papacy, despite its lofty claims to divine authority. Although Boniface was eventually rescued by loyal local forces, the psychological and political shock of this public humiliation, coupled with his death shortly thereafter, left the Church shaken and grappling with a crisis of power and prestige. What makes the story of Boniface VIII especially fascinating is the complexity of his personality. He was a man who combined exceptional legal brilliance with deep spiritual zeal, all wielded alongside ruthless political calculation. Boniface truly believed in the sacred mission of the Church and was devoted to defending its doctrine, yet he also acted with the cold pragmatism and sometimes brutal tactics of a medieval statesman playing a high-stakes game. This intriguing duality continues to fuel ongoing scholarly debates about whether Boniface should be remembered primarily as a staunch defender of Church doctrine or rather as an overreaching autocrat whose ambitions pushed the papacy toward conflict and decline. A quirky and lesser-known tidbit about Boniface VIII is that he is sometimes remembered as the pope who condemned the game of football, which was in fact the medieval precursor to modern soccer, due to its violent nature. Concerned that the game distracted people from their religious duties and often led to serious injuries, he issued a papal decree forbidding the sport. Picture the Pope acting as the ultimate sports referee, stepping in to ban a popular pastime simply because its players were too rough and unruly. While historians still debate the actual impact of this decree on the development and popularity of the game, it remains a curious reminder that the influence of the papacy extended far beyond church walls and into the everyday lives and leisure activities of medieval people. Boniface's papacy also marks the beginning of a significant decline in papal prestige, a decline that would culminate in the infamous Avignon papacy. This was the period when popes abandoned Rome and took up residence in Avignon, France, for several decades, a development that symbolized the Church's waning independence and authority. The bitter conflict between Boniface and King Philip IV essentially set the stage for this crisis. Revealing the limits of papal power when faced with determined and politically savvy monarchs who refused to yield, some scholars argue that Boniface's aggressive and confrontational approach to power may have inadvertently hastened the Church's loss of moral authority in the eyes of many believers. His reign, while pivotal and impactful, is often viewed as emblematic of a papacy struggling to balance its spiritual mission with increasingly ambitious temporal ambitions that sometimes undermine its own moral and religious standing. As you lie back and let your mind wander, picture the resolute figure of Boniface VIII standing firm against kings and armies, issuing bold proclamations and unyielding decrees from the papal throne. Yet beneath the surface of his confident facade, the old medieval order was beginning to tremble, shaken by the weight of competing powers and emerging challenges. His story stands as a vivid and dramatic chapter in the long saga of popes who wielded divine power while grappling with very human flaws: arrogance, stubbornness, and unrelenting ambition, all woven tightly into the rich and complex robes of the pontiff. You now ease gently into the early 14th century, a time marked by turbulence and uncertainty for the papacy. The Church is still reeling from the violent and humiliating clashes experienced during the reign of Boniface VIII. It is at this moment that the papacy embarks on a prolonged period of exile and political intrigue, an era now known as the Avignon papacy. Your next companion on this somber journey through history is Pope Clement V, a man whose election would signify a critical turning point for the political fortunes of the Church. Clement V is most famously remembered for his momentous decision to move the papal residence away from Rome, the Eternal City, to the smaller and less illustrious French city of Avignon. This city on the banks of the Rhône River would become the seat of the papacy for nearly 70 years, a shift that historians still vigorously debate regarding its profound and long-lasting impact on the reputation and spiritual authority of the Church. Imagine the scene: the Pope is no longer seated in Rome, surrounded by its grand basilicas, majestic cathedrals, and the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of Christian history. Instead, he resides in a fortified and somewhat provincial town far from the grandeur and traditions of the Italian capital. This relocation, originally intended as a temporary measure to escape the chaotic and dangerous political environment of Rome, gradually came to symbolize the growing entanglement between the papacy and the French crown. Clement V himself was a Frenchman, and his close ties to the French monarchy led many critics to accuse him of acting more as a puppet of King Philip IV than as an independent spiritual leader serving the universal church. One of the most infamous and consequential acts of Clement V's pontificate was his decision to suppress the Knights Templar. The Templars were a powerful and wealthy military order that had gained immense influence through their participation in the Crusades and their pioneering role in medieval banking. However, their downfall came abruptly after King Philip IV, heavily indebted to the order, pressured the Pope to take decisive action against them. Under a cloud of dubious accusations including heresy, sodomy, and corruption, Clement V authorized the formal dissolution of the Knights Templar in 1312. Following this decree, many Templars were arrested, subjected to brutal torture, and in some cases executed. To this day, historians fiercely debate the legitimacy of the charges against the Templars, with many arguing that these accusations were fabricated to serve political and financial interests rather than genuine spiritual concerns. This episode stands as a strange and complex twist in history, revealing how the demise of one of the most famous and enigmatic organizations of the Middle Ages was deeply intertwined with financial troubles and political machinations. The mysterious treasures said to have been amassed by the Templars, along with their secret rituals and clandestine activities, have since sparked countless legends, conspiracy theories, and fictional tales. Their suppression remains a story that blurs the lines between historical fact and myth. Fueling intrigue and speculation even centuries later, another interesting and lesser-known detail about Clement V concerns the deep resentment he inspired among the people of Rome. Because he abandoned their beloved city and relocated the papal seat to Avignon, the Romans disliked him intensely. So strong was this animosity that after his death, his body was secretly moved and reburied in a more discreet and hidden location, away from the public eye. This clandestine act hints at the profound bitterness his papacy had stirred among the Roman populace, who viewed the move to Avignon as a betrayal of the Church's traditional home and authority. Clement V's reign also highlights a central scholarly debate that continues to engage historians and theologians alike. Was the Avignon papacy a necessary response to the political chaos, factional violence, and instability that plagued Rome at the time? Or was it a dangerous concession that severely eroded the independence, moral authority, and spiritual leadership of the papacy? This debate captures the fundamental tension between the ideal of spiritual guidance and the harsh realities of political power. Tensions that have haunted the Church throughout its long history. As you sink deeper into your pillow and let your imagination take hold, picture the grand and imposing halls of Avignon filled with the murmur of intrigue and whispered secrets. Here, beneath the polished surface of papal ceremony, the spiritual glow of the Church begins to dim, weighed down by the complexities of political games and worldly ambitions. The tenure of Clement V stands as a somber reminder of how even the holiest and most revered offices can become ensnared in the struggles of human power, setting the stage for a Church striving to find its way amid the shifting tides of influence and authority. You remain nestled within the soft haze of sleep-bound thought, drifting ever further into the tumultuous 14th century. As your mind wanders through this unsettled era, you find yourself surrounded not by the presence of a single pope, but by the shadows of two, and sometimes even three competing pontiffs. This is the time of the Western Schism, one of the most chaotic and divisive chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. At the very center of this storm stands Pope Urban VI, a man whose election in the year 1378 would shatter the unity of the Church in a way that had never been witnessed before and has rarely been matched since. Urban VI, originally named Bartolomeo Prignano, was meant to be a compromise candidate. He was a non-cardinal, elevated to the papacy in hopes of satisfying the demands of the Roman mobs who clamored loudly for an Italian pope after decades of the Avignon papacy, during which the French exerted dominant control over the Church. The College of Cardinals, who elected him, had hoped to find a pontiff who would be pliable, peaceful, and capable of calming the increasingly restless political climate. However, their expectations were soon shattered, as Urban VI proved to be anything but the easygoing leader they had envisioned. from the very moment he assumed power, Urban VI came with a fiery determination and a sharp, biting temper. He alienated many of the cardinals who had elected him by launching into fierce and wild tirades. He scolded them relentlessly for their indulgence in luxury, openly condemning their corrupt habits and moral failings. Urban saw himself as a reformer of the highest order, a man committed to ascetic virtue and spiritual renewal. Yet his way of communicating these ideals was anything but gentle. It was more like the furious sting of a hornet trapped inside a glass jar, desperate to break free. At first glance, one might be tempted to admire Urban's strictness and determination to cleanse the Church from within. After all, who could oppose a pope intent on reform and renewal? But as time passed, the darker side of his rule became impossible to ignore. Stories began to emerge about how he imprisoned, tortured, and even possibly murdered cardinals who dared to oppose or displease him. Yes, it is true, a pope who may have ordered the brutal torture of his very own inner circle. One account even suggests that in the year 1385, he had 6 cardinals executed and personally supervised their torment. Such intense micromanagement was unlike anything the Church had ever seen before. This erratic and unhinged style of leadership quickly caused panic and outrage among the cardinals. Many fled the city of Rome in fear for their lives, declaring Urban VI's election invalid due to the extreme pressure and chaos that surrounded it. They then elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who promptly established his court back in Avignon. Suddenly, the Catholic Church found itself with 2 popes, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. Both pontiffs excommunicated the other and gathered their own loyal nations and followers, resembling warring factions more than spiritual leaders. This turbulent period became known as the Western Schism, an extraordinarily confusing and painful split that left the average medieval parishioner bewildered and uncertain about which pope to obey. The Kingdom of France, along with Spain and Scotland, sided with the Avignon pope. Meanwhile, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Italy remained loyal to the Roman pontiff. It was much like being caught in the middle of a bitter and awkward divorce where neither parent seemed particularly sane or trustworthy. Here is a quirky detail to carry with you into your dreams tonight. Urban VI was so consumed by paranoia and suspicion that he reportedly forbade any cardinals from meeting privately without his direct supervision. He believed conspiracies lurked everywhere, and he frequently berated bishops and diplomats during meals, public ceremonies, and formal gatherings. You might picture him pacing the marbled halls of the Vatican, dressed in his fine robes, eyes wide with mistrust, harshly barking accusations over bowls of broth while surrounded by whispering clerics trying to avoid his wrath. Historians continue to debate Urban VI's true nature to this day. Was he mad, morally corrupt, or simply overwhelmed by the impossible burden placed on him? Some scholars suggest he suffered from a mental illness that worsened under the crushing weight of expectations to reform a deeply fractured institution. Others argue that he was a cruel opportunist, intoxicated by power and utterly deaf to any notion of compromise or diplomacy. Regardless of the cause, his papacy irreparably split the Church down the middle and set off nearly 40 years of rival popes and bitter divisions. And what of poor Europe during these trying times? Imagine yourself as a peasant caught in the midst of this chaos, already struggling to survive plagues, famines, and wars. Now, on top of all this suffering, you are expected to choose between 2 popes, each claiming authority over your soul and your salvation. If you were to pray to the wrong one, would your prayers be heard? Would your sacraments still hold meaning and power? Such spiritual uncertainty would hardly offer the comfort needed at the end of a long and difficult day. By the time Urban VI passed away in 1389, the damage had already been done. The Western Schism continued on, with rival lines of popes in Rome and Avignon, each crowning successors in their own claim to legitimacy. Both insisted they were the true vicar of Christ, and the Church remained divided for decades. It would require yet another council, many years later, to begin the slow and painful process of healing the wounds and stitching the Church back together. For now, allow the image of Urban VI to drift slowly through your sleepy mind. Picture a stern-eyed reformer who burned his bridges without hesitation, igniting the fuse of division and discord. Imagine him pacing the grand marbled halls of the Vatican, suspicion coursing through his veins, a pope who shouted too loud and ultimately split the church into two opposing halves. You drift even deeper now, wrapped in shadows and whispers, and suddenly the world around you begins to blur, not with just one pope, nor with two, but with three. Yes, you remain caught in the long and dizzying aftershocks of the Western Schism, and the confusion is about to grow even more bewildering. Welcome to the turbulent reign of Pope John XXI, not the beloved 20th century reformer familiar to many, but the far less flattering 15th century version who might just rank among the most corrupt and scandalous popes in the entire history of the Church. Your mind gently lands in the early 1400s, a time when the Council of Pisa was convened in the year 1409. The purpose of this council was to bring an end to the chaos that had been caused by the existence of two rival popes. The solution that this gathering produced, however, was anything but straightforward. Instead of resolving the crisis, the Council of Pisa chose to elect a third pope, plunging the Church into even greater disarray. That third man was Baldassare Casa, a cardinal from Naples with an infamous reputation for his taste for extravagant living, ruthless political maneuvering, and believe it or not, possible involvement in piracy. Yes, you read that correctly. There is historical evidence suggesting that Baldassare spent part of his youth actively assisting his family in operating actual pirate ventures in the Gulf of Naples. This was not merely a metaphor for his corrupt lifestyle, he quite literally hailed from a background filled with sea raiders and lawlessness. One could imagine him swapping swords and pistols on the high seas on Saturday, then donning his clerical robes and participating in religious ordination on Sunday. When the Council of Pisa elected Baldassare as pope, he adopted the name John XXII. His aim was to present himself as a figure of unity who could heal the fractured church, but his methods and behavior could not have been further from saintly. John XXII made a business out of selling indulgences as if they were raffle tickets, auctioned off high-ranking church offices to the highest bidder, and indulged in a lifestyle that resembled more that of a lavish Renaissance prince than the humble and spiritual successor of St. Peter. Picture the scene of his court, sumptuous silk robes glistening in candlelight, glittering banquets overflowing with food and wine, armies of advisors bustling through ornate halls, whispered deals made in shadowy corridors, mistresses kept in private chambers, and coins flowing freely in every direction. John XXII was famous for riding into towns accompanied by processions more extravagant than even those of kings and emperors, and his appetite for luxury made him a magnet for scandalous gossip that echoed throughout all of Christendom. One particularly juicy detail passed down by chroniclers involves accusations that John XXII maintained dozens of mistresses and fathered numerous illegitimate children. Although it is difficult to separate fact from the angry propaganda spread by his many enemies, what is clear is that he treated the papal office less as a sacred spiritual responsibility and more as a ruthless power grab. Eventually, the burden of so many popes vying for authority exhausted the patience of Christendom. The Church decided to call the Council of Constance in 1414, with the hope that this gathering would finally resolve the seemingly endless schism. John XXII agreed to attend the council, but not without secretly plotting his escape in case the situation turned against him. Spoiler alert, things did indeed get very uncomfortable for him. During the Council of Constance, John XXII was confronted with a long list of accusations. They included simony, which is the selling of church offices, charges of fornication, theft, murder, and even heresy. Historians still debate how accurate these accusations were, as some of the charges were almost certainly exaggerated or politically motivated. Despite this, John XXII was officially deposed in 1415. But before his removal could be fully enforced, he actually attempted a desperate escape. Imagine the Pope himself sneaking away in the dead of night, disguised as a lowly servant, hood drawn low to conceal his identity, slipping through dark back alleys while the bishops and cardinals slept peacefully, unaware of his flight. Not quite the image of a saintly and humble pontiff, is it? John XXII was soon captured, imprisoned, and stripped of his papal title. However, his story did not end in total disgrace. Thanks to the influence of the powerful Medici family, he was eventually released and even somewhat rehabilitated. The Medici helped him return to Rome, where he was granted the rank of cardinal once again. He lived out the remainder of his days in this reduced but respectable position, passing away in 1419. While not entirely disgraced, he was certainly far from sainted. To this day, historians continue to debate whether John XCI was simply an opportunist caught in a chaotic power vacuum, or if he was a full-blown villain who deliberately exploited the turmoil for his own selfish gain. Some see him as just another unfortunate product of the messy politics of the 15th century church, a time when cardinals acted more like secular princes and popes wielded swords as readily as they carried rosaries. Others, less forgiving, label him the worst pope of the worst century in church history. Here is a strange and somewhat ironic twist to his legacy. Because the 20th century Pope John XCI chose to use the same papal name when he was elected in 1958, long after Baldassare Casa's disgrace. The Vatican quietly removed the earlier John XCI from the official papal numbering system. Today, the Church pretends as if the medieval John XCI simply did not exist. It is as though they erased a bad X from the pages of history, conveniently skipping over an embarrassing chapter. You feel the absurdity of this entire situation settle around you like a thick, warm fog. 3 popes reigning at the same time. A council called to fix the problem that instead created an even greater mess. A pirate pope sneaking away in the dead of night. It all feels like a strange dream, but one that is strangely compelling and vivid. Allow your thoughts to soften as Baldassare Casa gradually fades from view. His robes dragging behind him as he trudges slowly toward obscurity. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe struggles desperately to clean up the tangled and chaotic mess he helped to create. You sink even deeper now, enveloped by the soft velvet calm of dusk settling over Avignon, that once glorious city where the popes had fled to escape the turmoil and chaos that gripped Rome. The shadows lengthen and stretch, growing heavier with each passing moment, carrying with them the dark and complicated legacy of one of the most reviled pontiffs ever to wear the triple tiara, Pope Urban VI. You find yourself transported to the year 1378. The papal conclave is in utter turmoil. The previous pope, Gregory XI, has just passed away in Rome, having only recently returned from what was called the Babylonian captivity, a period of nearly 70 years during which the papacy had been firmly entrenched in Avignon rather than the traditional seat in Rome. The mood in Rome is electric and restless. The Roman mob, increasingly impatient and feeling forgotten, demands that this time, the new pope must be Italian. After enduring 7 consecutive French popes, Italy felt more like a neglected child than the rightful center of Christendom. Fearing for their own safety, literally fearing for their lives, the cardinals yield to the pressures of the Roman mob and choose an Italian to fill the papal throne, Bartolomeo Prignano, who takes the papal name Urban VI. At first glance, Urban appears to be a safe choice. He is known to be pious, austere, and seemingly committed to the reform of the Church. Surely, this is a positive development, a win for the spiritual health of the institution. One might hope, but alas, things do not unfold as expected. It quickly becomes apparent that Urban's temperament is far from calm or measured. His personality can only be described as volcanic. He erupts in fury at cardinals during meetings without warning or restraint. He openly accuses his fellow churchmen of simony, corruption, gluttony, and every imaginable vice. On one occasion, he even resorts to physically striking cardinals in public. His fury knows no bounds and he does not shy away from expressing it even in front of important foreign dignitaries. Imagine the most terrifying and unforgiving school principal you have ever known, then imagine that same person suddenly wielding a small army and divine authority. Urban is far more than a man of harsh words. He threatens, punishes, and isolates those who oppose him with ruthless efficiency. Most shockingly, he begins ordering executions. Yes, executions of cardinals, men who were supposed to be among the highest leaders of the Church. This is no exaggeration or clerical rumor. The Pope himself has these deadly sentences carried out. The shocking behavior of Urban VI quickly alienates the majority of the Church's leadership. The very cardinals who had elected him now claim that their choice was invalid, insisting that they were coerced by the angry Roman mob. In an act of outright rebellion, they elect a rival pope, Clement VII. Clement takes up residence in Avignon, reviving the schism that had only recently ended. Thus, the Western Schism is born once more. From this point forward, two popes simultaneously claim to be the true leader of the Catholic Church. Urban VI rules from Rome, while Clement VII holds court in Avignon. This division tears Europe apart. Nations choose sides. France, Scotland, and Castile support Clement. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Nordic countries stand behind Urban. Ordinary Christians are left in anguish, uncertain which pope holds the rightful claim. Should they follow the pope who screams at his own cardinals and orders their executions, or the one who is widely seen as a political puppet of the French crown? Urban's response to this crisis is to entrench himself further. He surrounds himself with loyal sycophants and loyalists who reinforce his iron grip on power. He issues declarations insisting that no pope should ever be elected under duress, a principle that sounds reasonable at first but reveals itself as a tool to invalidate any attempts to depose him in the future. On top of this, he proclaims the discovery of a conspiracy among 6 cardinals, whom he had allegedly tortured and executed. The idea of a pope personally torturing high-ranking church officials is almost beyond belief, yet these accusations persisted and formed part of his infamously dark reputation. One peculiar detail stands out in the story of Urban VI. Unlike many of his predecessors, this pope had a fascination with construction and fortifications. He began building a massive fortress at Nocera, a structure that seemed designed more for his own protection against enemies than to glorify God or serve the faithful. Urban was well aware that he was deeply hated and distrusted. He believed daggers lurked behind every friendly smile, and paranoia ruled his actions. Vatican archives still hold letters from his own staff warning others not to contradict the Pope under any circumstances, for fear of provoking his violent wrath. Urban VI died in 1389, likely from injuries sustained in a fall, although whispers circulated that he might have been poisoned. Some contemporaries believed his demise was divine judgment for his many sins and cruelties. Even today, historians debate whether Urban was truly mad or simply a tyrant intoxicated by absolute power. Was his ferocity a symptom of genuine mental instability, or was he a man desperately attempting to purge the Church of corruption, albeit with a merciless and overwhelming force better suited to destruction than reform? His legacy is far from the kind that would be carved in stained glass windows or celebrated in hymns. Urban VI left behind not a church healed and united, but one that was deeply fractured and torn apart by competing loyalties and political strife. The schism he helped ignite would drag on for nearly 4 decades, with rival popes excommunicating one another, engaging in political machinations, and leaving ordinary believers to question not only which pope was the true shepherd of Christ but even whether they should recognize any pope at all. You sense the world shifting beneath the weight of Urban's many contradictions. A man who was meant to unify the Church instead became a wrecking ball. A reformer who resorted to torture and murder of his own clergy. A man called of God who erected castles as barriers to keep God's people away. There is a bitter, almost suffocating atmosphere hanging in the air, like the scent of burnt incense lingering long after the church bells have fallen silent. As your thoughts begin to soften, lulled by the flickering candlelight dancing through the cracked chapel walls, the figure of Urban VI slowly dissolves into the haze of memory, part tyrant, part tragic figure. You find rest now, cushioned in irony, with a pope who burned bridges far faster than he built churches. Your breath slows as you drift down a quieter corridor of time, only to find yourself bumping headfirst into one of history's strangest ecclesiastical plot twists. Welcome to the early 15th century. The Western Schism is still very much alive, lurching into ever more bewildering territory. And now, prepare yourself, because things are about to become even more surreal. There are not one, not two, but 3 popes. Yes, 3 men, all claiming to be the one true pontiff. If the idea of 2 rival popes was confusing, 3 is nothing short of pure theological pandemonium, a holy traffic jam with no spiritual right-of-way. Amid this overcrowded roster of papal contenders, one name rises to the surface for all the wrong reasons: Pope John XXII. Not to be confused with the widely loved and canonized John XXII of the 20th century. No, this earlier version is something else entirely. Think of him less as a guiding light of Vatican II and more as the Church's forgotten error message, blinking awkwardly in the dark. His real name was Baldassare Casa, and his qualifications for spiritual leadership were, to put it politely, unconventional. You stir from your sleepy haze and find yourself in the year 1410. The scene is turbulent, filled with ecclesiastical tension and political maneuvering. Casa has just been elected pope by the Council of Pisa, a gathering intended to fix the papal mess but which, in practice, only made things worse. Unfortunately for him, the 2 existing popes, the ones in Rome and Avignon, refused to acknowledge Pisa's authority. So when Casa takes the papal name John XXII, he becomes the 3rd claimant to the papal throne, essentially turning the entire Catholic world into a stage for a 3-act farce. Later, the Church would declare his papacy illegitimate, quietly erasing him from the official list of popes for centuries. A tragic footnote, or perhaps a cautionary tale. But let's rewind a bit. Baldassare Casa did not hail from a background of piety, learning, or quiet contemplation. He was, according to multiple accounts, a pirate. Yes, a literal pirate. Before his rise through the Church's hierarchy, he allegedly served in the Neapolitan Navy, engaging in sea raids, capturing ships, and plundering goods with the kind of swashbuckling bravado that feels more appropriate for a high-seas adventure novel than for the Vatican archives. His early resume leans more toward Jack Sparrow than St. Peter, yet, despite or perhaps because of his colorful past, Casa climbed the ecclesiastical ladder with impressive speed. Once pope, he wasted no time embracing the trappings of power. He wore sumptuous robes, threw extravagant feasts, and surrounded himself with beautiful mistresses and political sycophants. His court became infamous for its opulence and moral laxity, resembling a decadent carnival rather than a place of spiritual authority. There were whispers of gambling, lavish entertainments, and debauched behavior, enough to make the Lateran Palace feel less like a sacred hall and more like a Renaissance-era Las Vegas with candles and Gregorian chant. Casa had no qualms about raising funds for his lavish lifestyle. He sold indulgences with the zeal of a street vendor hawking souvenirs. The transaction was simple and unapologetic: commit a sin, drop a coin, and walk away forgiven. Critics at the time likened the practice to turning salvation into a kind of divine vending machine, operated by a man whose primary talent seemed to be playing the system. One particularly bizarre and revealing detail: Casa fancied himself a collector of holy relics. At one point, he claimed to own the head of John the Baptist. Actually, he claimed to own 2 of them. Which, unless the Baptist was hiding a secret as a mythical hydra, raised more than a few skeptical eyebrows. Yet even in this, he seemed confident, unbothered by logic, and immune to contradiction. Despite the scandals, Casa was no fool. He had sharp political instincts and a talent for manipulating power structures. He juggled allegiances, read the winds of political favor, and positioned himself with remarkable agility. But as the Western Schism dragged on and the spiritual crisis deepened, even his own supporters began to grow uneasy. The weight of too much absurdity, even in a chaotic church, eventually demands resolution. In 1415, the long-awaited Council of Constance convened to bring an end to the schism once and for all. All 3 popes were called to attend. The 2 others resisted and delayed. But John XXII, Baldassare Casa, initially agreed to step down. Then, in a twist worthy of a stage play, he panicked. Instead of resigning, he disguised himself as a humble servant and fled the city under cover of darkness. No regal regalia. No tiara. Just a desperate man, cloaked in borrowed clothes, galloping toward the horizon on a fast horse, hoping not to be recognized, but his escape did not go as planned. He was captured, unceremoniously dragged back, and placed on trial. The list of accusations leveled against him was astonishing in both scope and audacity. There were 70 charges in total, encompassing everything from murder and simony to sodomy, incest, and piracy. The most damning of all, perhaps, was the simple assertion that he had been profoundly unfit for the office of Pope. Whether these charges were all true or partly inflated by political rivals remains a matter of historical debate. But either way, the damage was done. Casa was deposed, stripped of his title, and imprisoned. Yet, curiously, his fall from grace was not absolute. After several years, he was released thanks to the intervention of powerful allies and the strategic application of generous bribes. And in one final twist of absurdity, the Church restored him to the rank of cardinal. Apparently, once someone has worn the papal slippers, it is hard to take them off entirely, no matter how muddy they have become. He died in 1419, no longer infamous, but no longer disgraced either, buried in Florence beneath a tomb sculpted by Donatello himself. A grand monument for a man whose legacy had been quietly erased but whose life had been anything but forgettable. Because, it turns out, even if your papacy is declared invalid and your name removed from the official annals, you can still hire excellent sculptors and leave behind a legacy wrapped in marble. There is something hauntingly surreal about his tale. A pirate becomes pope. A pope becomes a fugitive. A fugitive becomes a cardinal. All of it unfolding against the backdrop of a Europe teetering on the edge of spiritual collapse, its faithful left wondering who, if anyone, truly holds the keys to heaven, and as you curl deeper into your pillow, your mind lingers on one final, absurd and strangely poetic detail. When the real John XXI, Angelo Roncalli, was elected in 1958, he was fully aware of his controversial predecessor. When asked about the name, his response was simple and dignified. He said, "Let's give the name a better reputation." With that, the impostor John XCI vanishes from the candlelit corridors of history, flickering out like a flame in a drafty chapel. Neither fully villain nor fully farce, he slips back into obscurity, leaving behind only whispers, scandals, and the occasional relic with an extra head. The flickering torchlight of your dream state leads you deeper into the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Europe, where once again the papal tiara finds its way onto the head of a man propelled more by ambition than sanctity. Tonight's insomniac villain is none other than Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, and if ever there were a family name soaked in scandal and intrigue, it would be this one. The Borgia tales come drenched in spice, seasoned heavily with whispers of corruption, betrayal, and decadence. It is the year 1492, a date immortalized in schoolbooks for the voyage of Columbus across the Atlantic. While caravels are braving the sea winds in pursuit of new worlds, a very different kind of exploration is taking place in Rome. This one has no sails or compasses, only bribes, poison rings, strategic marriages, and opulent feasts where alliances are forged over veal and venality. The Vatican becomes the stage for a conquest of an entirely different kind. Rodrigo Borgia secures the papacy not through divine inspiration or saintly virtue, but through a campaign of calculated bribery. Historians continue to debate whether he handed out 3,000 or perhaps even 5,000 ducats per vote during the conclave. What remains indisputable is that the sacred gathering of the College of Cardinals resembled less a solemn deliberation and more a finely tuned auction house. He emerges victorious and assumes the name Alexander VI, immediately transforming the Vatican into a Borgia stronghold. He wastes no time embedding his bloodline into the highest levels of church authority. Relatives are raised to positions of power, with appointments that seem driven more by genetics than merit. His son Cesare, a young man of 18, is made a cardinal almost overnight. The papal treasury is treated less like a sacred trust and more like a family bank account, open for withdrawal at the patriarch's convenience. If nepotism were a religion, Alexander would be its high priest, Then there is Lucrezia Borgia, the daughter whose name has echoed through centuries like a siren song wrapped in mystery. She is remembered through a haze of rumor, her legacy stained with tales of poison, seduction, and secret liaisons. The truth is murkier, obscured by conflicting accounts, but what remains certain is her value as a political instrument. Her marriages are arranged and rearranged with cold calculation. Each union less about romance and more about cementing her father's position in the political chessboard of Italy. Cesare Borgia, though, demands our focus for a moment. Often painted as the archetypal Renaissance villain, Cesare begins in the robes of the church, only to shed them for armor and steel. He abandons his religious post in favor of military conquest, becoming his father's unofficial general and executing bold campaigns to extend papal control. His tactics are brutal, efficient, and at times brilliant. Under his command, the papacy behaves less like a spiritual institution and more like an expansionist kingdom. Picture your local priest declaring war on the next town over, and you begin to grasp the strangeness of the era. Now enter the whispered realm of poison. The infamous Borgia poisonings are the stuff of legend. Did they possess hollow rings used to discreetly drip venom into rivals' drinks? Were guests invited to dinner only to find dessert was the last thing they'd ever taste? Some scholars dismissed the stories as Renaissance slander. Others insist the rumors are rooted in fact. The nickname Duke of Poison did not appear out of thin air, and Cesare's enemies did have an uncanny tendency to vanish or expire under mysterious circumstances. What cannot be disputed is that the Borgias maintained an aura of menace. Enemies fell away, allies walked carefully, and Rome buzzed with conspiracies and fear. At the center of this web of control and cunning sat Alexander VI, presiding over opulent banquets and glittering ceremonies while the holy city seethed beneath the surface. His romantic entanglements were no less scandalous. Rodrigo Borgia had multiple mistresses, with the most prominent being Venanza de Catania. Together they had 4 children, all while he wore the papal crown. 4 children, while serving as pope. The contradiction between his role and his private life was so stark it nearly cracked the marble pillars of St. Peter's in embarrassment. And then there is the banquet that makes even the most jaded gasp, the infamous banquet of the chestnuts. Hosted by Cesare within the Vatican itself, this night of debauchery allegedly included a feast, an entourage of 50 courtesans, and a peculiar contest involving the collection of chestnuts from the floor. It is a scene that reads more like a theatrical farce than a chapter in church history. Whether exaggerated or real, the tale refuses to fade. And its mere persistence speaks volumes. Despite the controversies, Alexander VI holds the papal throne for more than a decade. He navigates the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics with skill, building alliances, extending influence, and enriching his family beyond imagination. To some, he is a master strategist, a bold leader in a ruthless age. To others, he is little more than a blasphemer draped in ecclesiastical robes. Somewhere between Machiavelli's Respect and Maury Povich's headlines, the truth shuffles along, difficult to pin down. In the end, it is not war or rebellion that unseats him, but his own consumption. In 1503, both Alexander VI and Cesare fall violently ill. The cause is uncertain, perhaps tainted food, possibly spoiled wine, or, as always, rumors of a poisoned chalice gone awry. Cesare recovers. His father does not. The Pope's death is swift and shrouded in speculation. A poetic justice, some suggest. Others blame Rome's unsanitary summer climate. What follows is chaos. Cardinals, perhaps fearing retribution or simply seizing opportunity, rush into the Vatican. They loot its riches with unholy enthusiasm, stripping tapestries, emptying vaults, and even making off with furniture. The body of the deceased pope, left unattended in the stifling heat, bloats and blackens in grotesque fashion before it is finally laid to rest. A macabre ending to a man who lived like royalty but died with the dignity of a forgotten tyrant. and still, Rodrigo Borgia's shadow lingers across the centuries. His name, infamous and unforgettable, echoes through history books, operas, novels, and television dramas. Machiavelli, never one to shy away from political admiration, even referenced Cesare in The Prince as a case study in calculated power, so as you pull the blanket closer and your breath slows beneath the weight of sleep, think of Pope Alexander VI. A figure who ruled not with humility or grace, but with cunning and ambition. A shepherd in title, but a Caesar in heart. He turned the church into a dynasty, surrounded by family, watched by enemies, and remembered for banquets that still haunt the annals of history. History does not speak fondly of him, but it will never forget his name. You drift a little deeper now, your eyelids fluttering gently in that strange, weightless space that lies between waking and dreaming. We move softly from one notorious Borgia to another shadowy chapter of papal infamy. The history of the papacy is never a dry affair, never short on conspiracy, ambition, and absurdity. And just when you begin to think it couldn't possibly get more outrageous than tales of poison rings, orgiastic parties featuring 50 courtesans, and corrupt cardinals feasting in candlelit excess, along comes Pope Julius II. Yes, Julius II, the warrior pope. That's right. Warrior, as in full battle armor, thundering hooves, clashing steel, and the lingering scent of gunpowder soaked into sacred vestments. Picture it clearly, the early years of the 1500s. Italy is not yet a unified country, but instead a fragmented patchwork of feuding city-states, each with its own ambitions, its own mercenaries, its own tangled alliances. Confusion reigns as swords are drawn and treaties crumble. In the midst of this volatile chaos stands Julius II, elected in the year 1503, not content to sit on a throne or pontificate from a balcony. No, this pope prefers the saddle to the sermon. He rides at the front of an army, not figuratively but literally, his sword gleaming, his beard catching the wind, his armor polished to a divine shine. One can almost hear the rhythmic pounding of battle drums competing with the solemn tolling of cathedral bells. Julius was never one for subtlety. He loathed corruption, but was never above exploiting it when the occasion called for it. He detested the infamous Borgia clan, yet he maneuvered through the murky waters of politics with every bit as much cunning. Historians still debate the true nature of his motives. Were his military campaigns driven by divine purpose or by personal hunger for power and glory? No one can say for certain, but what is indisputable is that he spent far more time riding into battle than he ever did delivering Sunday homilies. He was born Giuliano della Rovere, and like many ambitious men of the cloth in his time, he clawed his way up the ecclesiastical hierarchy through a strategic blend of familial connections and generous financial persuasion. During the conclave that eventually elected him pope, he made sweeping promises to the cardinal electors. These were grand pledges that were, unsurprisingly, almost immediately broken. Yet in those days, breaking one's word upon ascending to the papacy was less a betrayal and more a well-established tradition, once enthroned. Julius wasted little time. He fixed his gaze on a lofty goal, to reclaim and reinforce the territories of the papal states, which had grown fractured and feeble under the leadership of previous pontiffs. And he was certainly not the sort to issue orders from the safety of the Vatican while sipping wine and waiting for reports. He donned actual plate armor, likely tailored to fit his papal stature, because even holy warlords appreciated a touch of flair. He personally led his troops into the thick of combat. He marched through muddy fields, laid siege to rebellious cities, and in one astonishing moment, scaled a ladder to inspect a breach in a fortified wall. He did all of this while dressed in full papal regalia. If your mind was starting to drift just then, try conjuring up the image of the Bishop of Rome on horseback, shouting commands to Swiss guards like the grizzled hero of a war epic. It's not exactly easy to picture Benedict XVI doing the same, is it? Yet Julius was not all brute force and martial bravado. Beneath the chainmail beat the heart of a patron of the arts, albeit one with a notoriously volcanic temper. When he wasn't laying waste to enemy territories, he was busy shaping the cultural soul of Rome. It was Julius who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Yes, the very same man who once threw a punch at a diplomat during Mass also gave the world one of its most transcendent artistic masterpieces. That ceiling, the one that so many now regard with reverence and awe, was born out of something very close to bullying. Michelangelo initially refused the project. He had no desire to fresco a chapel ceiling. Julius, however, was not in the mood for dissent. He all but threatened the artist, demanding that the ceiling be painted or there would be consequences. You can thank a little holy intimidation for the creation of Adam. There is even a colorful tale. Perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, that Julius would sneak into the chapel during the night to inspect Michelangelo's progress by candlelight. On at least one occasion, he was reportedly so displeased with what he saw that he hurled a hammer in a fit of rage. Whether this is fact or just delicious Renaissance gossip remains unclear, but it certainly fits the known contours of Julius's character. He was famously impatient. He had no time for slow progress. He wanted Rome to rise again, to blaze like a beacon among cities, and he wanted it done yesterday. Speaking of rising, Julius also laid the first stone of what would become the new St. Peter's Basilica. And not in a metaphorical sense. He actually tore down the old basilica, which had stood for centuries, and ordered the construction of an entirely new edifice. It was an audacious architectural move, akin to someone suggesting we knock down Notre Dame in Paris and replace it with something glossier. The project would take over a century to complete, long after Julius was gone, but his vision shaped its every angle. His legacy is carved into each marble pillar and gilded molding. Politically, however, his record is far more erratic. Julius had an intense dislike for France, at least until he needed France. He launched furious condemnations of Venice, only to later join forces with them. His diplomatic strategy could be described as reactive, impulsive, and driven by a constantly shifting calculation of advantage. He reversed alliances faster than you could redraw a map of Renaissance Italy. But through it all, every unpredictable move was aimed at bolstering the Church's temporal power. Spiritual matters seemed to take a back seat. His temper was infamous. Perhaps even legendary. He did not merely disapprove, he exploded. He screamed at ambassadors, excommunicated those who crossed him, and unleashed curses that would scandalize even the most jaded sailor. One diplomat once reported that Julius became so enraged during a negotiation that he smashed his papal staff against the floor, shattering it to pieces, simply because someone mentioned the word peace a few too many times. If you are picturing the Pope with his face flushed red, eyes blazing, and veins bulging like a cartoon character mid-tantrum, you are not far from the truth, and yet, despite the volatility, the outbursts, the sword-waving and ceiling-threatening, there was a genuine sense of purpose behind Julius's storm. He truly believed he was restoring the glory of the Church. He wanted to secure its lands, re-establish its dominance, and transform Rome into a capital of power, culture, and divine authority. He wanted to be remembered not just as a pope, but as a force of history. And in many respects, he was. His patronage helped usher in a golden age of art and architecture. His military campaigns preserved the Papal States from being overrun. His iron will created a new archetype for the papacy, a leader who could command both armies and artists with the same unshakable conviction. Spiritually, however, his legacy is far more muted. His sermons are forgotten, his theological writings largely non-existent. He was not a shepherd leading souls with humility and grace. To Julius, the papacy was not symbolized by a crook. It was defined by a sword, a weapon he wielded with astonishing ferocity. So now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts grow misty, let your mind linger on the striking image of Julius II. See him thundering into battle beneath a flapping papal banner, bellowing orders across a muddy battlefield, then returning to Rome covered in dust, only to berate Michelangelo over lunch. It may not be the bedtime story you were expecting. But it is the story history gives us: sleep well, knowing that once upon a time, the man who ruled the church also rode like a general. And the majestic ceiling above your head? You might just owe it to a holy warlord in white robes, with a temper hotter than hell and a vision large enough to touch the heavens. You're floating now, somewhere between the celestial grandeur of the Sistine Chapel and the blood-streaked chaos of a medieval battlefield, but don't drift too far away. Because just around the next bend in this dreamlike reverie comes yet another papal paradox. If Julius II was the warrior pope, brandishing swords and commissioning ceilings, then Pope Leo X was something else entirely. Call him the party pope. Less armor, more velvet robes. Less bloodshed, more banquets. Picture the Vatican not as a sacred seat of solemn power, but as a lavish Renaissance lounge where the heady scent of incense blended with the rich perfume of wine, and where cardinals murmured in shadowed corners about commissions, cousins, and courtly intrigues. Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici in 1475, was unmistakably and unapologetically a Medici. Yes, that Medici family, the famously powerful banking dynasty of Florence, a clan that balanced art patronage, financial wizardry, and political manipulation like acts in a perfectly choreographed opera. By the time Giovanni ascended the papal throne in 1513, the Medici name already carried immense influence. But his rise to power felt like watching a pampered princeling stroll into a position far beyond his depth, only to immediately throw the most decadent, excessive coronation celebration Rome had ever witnessed. Imagine the scene in vivid detail: elephants adorned in elaborate silks marching proudly down the cobblestone streets of the Eternal City. Servants coated in shimmering gold paint moving like living statues. Fountains bubbling not with water, but with sweet, intoxicating wine. The papal treasury, already precariously depleted, became an afterthought to Leo, who seemed to gesture at the looming financial strain with a smile and say, "Let's worry about that after dessert." He famously, or perhaps infamously, declared, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Whether he truly uttered those words remains a matter of historical debate. Some scholars believe it was a biting invention of his critics, a cynical whisper passed through the marble corridors of Rome. But regardless of its authenticity, the sentiment captures the spirit of his reign. This was a pope who adored opera, delighted in the hunt, and lavished money on the arts with unrestrained enthusiasm. He once presented a foreign diplomat with a gold chess set so valuable it could have funded a modest kingdom, all while the destitute masses begged outside Rome's crumbling gates. Yet make no mistake, Leo was no fool basking idly in luxury. He was cunning, image-savvy, and every bit the political animal his lineage demanded. He grasped the value of spectacle, the power of optics. Like many Renaissance rulers, he wielded art and culture not just as indulgences, but as tools of dominance. He extended the legacy of Julius II by pouring resources into artistic commissions that transformed the Vatican into something resembling a Renaissance theme park. Raphael thrived during his reign, producing masterpieces that defined the era. Leo even attempted to draw Michelangelo back into the papal orbit. Michelangelo, ever the brooding genius, preferred to keep his distance and his solitude. Still, for all his taste and strategic flair, Leo harbored a blind spot. A vast, glittering, perilous blind spot. It was during his papacy that the first unmistakable fractures in the Church's authority began to split wide open. As Leo sipped rare vintages from silver goblets and basked in candlelight, a German monk named Martin Luther quietly began drafting a list of grievances that would soon rattle Christendom. The practice of selling indulgences, those paper certificates that promised a shortcut through purgatory, had existed for decades. Think of them as spiritual coupons. Pay a fee, and your sins got scrubbed cleaner in the eyes of God. But Leo took this practice and amplified it dramatically, using indulgence sales to bankroll his most ambitious and expensive project, the completion of the new St. Peter's Basilica. To fund this divine construction, Leo sent preachers across Europe who hawked salvation like traveling salesmen, promising eternal bliss in exchange for a few coins, among them stood Johann Tetzel, the master pitchman of indulgences. He wandered from town to town, reciting his now infamous jingle, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." It had the ring of a Renaissance-era infomercial, catchy and manipulative. But where many saw opportunity, Martin Luther saw blasphemy. In 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, challenging the very foundation of indulgence doctrine. At the time, he did not intend to ignite a religious revolution. His goal was reform, not rebellion. But bloated systems rarely tolerate disruption, and the spark he lit quickly roared into a firestorm. Leo's reaction was one of remarkable underestimation. He brushed Luther off as a drunken friar whose sense would return once the wine wore off. It didn't. Luther stood firm, and the tremors of change began to shake the continent. Thus began the Protestant Reformation, one of the most monumental upheavals in the history of Western Christianity. While Luther wrote and preached, Leo continued living lavishly. He feasted, commissioned fireworks, and hunted peacocks. The world shifted around him, but inside his velvet-curtained chambers, life remained a steady stream of spectacle and indulgence. Yet Leo was not without capability. When he applied himself, he revealed the sharp mind of an able administrator. He tightened papal control in certain regions and manipulated political marriages and alliances with the tactical precision of a seasoned diplomat. His chessboard was Europe, and he moved pieces with the calm confidence of a master. But for every clever political move he made, there were 10 more decisions soaked in extravagance. He appointed relatives to powerful church positions, securing Medici dominance. He spent recklessly. By the time he died in 1521, both the Vatican treasury and the Church's moral authority were in serious disrepair. His death came suddenly. Some whispered of poison, though most believe he succumbed to pneumonia. His body was so bloated in the end that the lid of his coffin would not fully close. The image lingers as a disturbingly fitting metaphor. A papacy swollen with luxury, blind optimism, and denial, straining at the seams under its own weight. And then there was Hanno, perhaps the most bizarre yet endearing relic of Leo's reign. Hanno was the first elephant ever kept as a papal pet in Rome. A gift from the King of Portugal, the young elephant quickly became a cherished figure in the papal court. Draped in golden embroidery and trained to kneel respectfully before crowds, Hanno was more than a curiosity. He became a symbol, a mascot of Leo's peculiar reign. When he died, possibly from constipation after being fed too many gold-laced treats, he was mourned with full ceremonial honors. The Vatican even commissioned a fresco in his memory. Yes, the Pope's elephant received a custom memorial painting while theological warfare raged beyond the city's walls. So now, as your breath deepens and you melt more fully into your pillow, let your thoughts linger on the image of Pope Leo X, seated upon his velvet throne, bathed in candlelight and harp music, surrounded by luxury and loyal courtiers. He remained blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully so, that the world beyond his marble palace was trembling, cracking, and about to change forever. If Julius II was a storm, loud, violent, and kinetic, then Leo X was the deceptive calm before an earthquake. He was gilded, perfumed, and serenely indifferent to the deep and growing rumblings just below the surface. You drift deeper now into a story soaked with mystery and shadow, where the papal tiara begins to shimmer less like a radiant symbol of divine authority and more like a cursed crown passed from one pair of crooked hands to the next. Welcome to the tale of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a name that still resounds through the annals of history with scandal, intrigue, and a level of drama that would leave even the most outrageous reality television series blushing in embarrassment. Rodrigo was elected pope in the fateful year of 1492, a date already infamous for the voyage of Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic Ocean, but perhaps even more notorious for what Rodrigo brought with him to the throne of St. Peter. His reign would last a mere 8 years, but during that brief span, he managed to transform the Vatican into something resembling a Renaissance soap opera set, replete with seduction, betrayal, and lavish excess. You can almost inhale the mingling scents of jasmine candles and heavily perfumed schemes as they waft through the hushed corridors of those opulent halls. Historians continue to debate whether Rodrigo was truly the villain that many have depicted him to be or simply the convenient target of vicious Renaissance gossip, spun by political rivals with agendas of their own. Regardless, the name Borgia became inextricably linked with tales of corruption, unchecked nepotism, and a brand of depravity that shocked even the worldliest of contemporaries. Imagine, if you will, a pope who did not merely have a few dark secrets, but who openly acknowledged his children, yes, more than one, and wielded the immense power of the papacy like a scepter, using it to secure the future of his bloodline. This was not your average celibate holy father. This was more akin to a Renaissance-era crime boss cloaked in ecclesiastical robes. Among Rodrigo's progeny, two figures emerged to cast especially long and complicated shadows across history: Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. Cesare, once destined for a life in the church, cast off his religious duties in favor of steel and strategy, becoming a fearsome and ambitious military leader. Lucrezia, meanwhile, found herself at the heart of countless rumors, from whispered poisonings to a string of politically engineered marriages and scandal-laced affairs. While modern historians suggest Lucrezia may have been more of a pawn in the family's political games than the scheming villainess of legend, her story remains tangled in the same dense fog of myth and half-truth that shrouds the entire Borgia legacy. Alexander VI's papacy was riddled with the kind of blatant nepotism that left few even pretending to be surprised. He heaped titles, lands, and privileges upon his relatives with stunning regularity, transforming the church's already fragile political apparatus into a dynastic machine operating at full tilt. It was as if one were watching a Renaissance version of Game of Thrones unfold, only with more silk, more incense, and significantly more gold embroidery. The Pope was also widely accused of practicing simony, the buying and selling of church offices, which he reportedly treated like coveted collector's items. This practice eroded the church's moral standing, weakening its spiritual credibility in a way that would prove difficult to repair. One of the stranger footnotes in this saga involves Rodrigo's taste for spectacle. He was known to host outrageously extravagant banquets, where the guests might be serenaded by music, dazzled by costume dancers, or startled by the sudden appearance of exotic animals. Camels, lions, and other creatures would be paraded through the Vatican gardens, which during his reign resembled something out of a fantastical storybook, lush with secret groves and decorative fountains. It was a surreal backdrop to the brutal political chess matches being played out behind closed doors. The darker chapters of his reign also include tales of poison plots designed to eliminate rivals. Though it remains uncertain whether Rodrigo orchestrated these plans himself or whether they were executed by his fiercely loyal and equally ambitious children, the rumors alone fed the growing cloud of fear and distrust that followed the Borgias wherever they went. Among the more bizarre accounts is one involving a poisoned ring and an assassin who reportedly died before he could even reach the gates of the Vatican, adding yet another layer of deadly folklore to an already infamous papacy. Yet, for all the excess and controversy, Alexander VI was not without skill. He was a sharp political thinker, a cunning strategist who knew how to balance alliances and manipulate the playing field to his advantage. He deftly navigated the shifting tides of war and diplomacy, managing thorny relationships with both France and Spain. He also played a pivotal role in global politics, notably through his involvement in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which carved up the newly discovered lands of the Americas between Spain and Portugal. That a pope would insert himself so directly into the affairs of empires across the ocean is a plot twist that still surprises those who stumble upon this chapter in church history. Alexander's death in 1503 came suddenly and, perhaps fittingly, under a haze of suspicion. Officially, it was attributed to malaria, but whispers of poison refused to fade. It was a familiar kind of ending for a papacy that had long thrived on rumor and fear. His once grand tomb in Rome was eventually destroyed centuries later, a quiet and symbolic gesture that seemed to reflect the Church's long-term desire to distance itself from the excesses and controversies of his rule. So now, as you nestle deeper into your pillow and let your breath slow into a steady rhythm, allow yourself to imagine the Vatican as it was under Alexander VI, a dazzling realm of candlelight and whispered secrets, where the sacred and the sordid performed a dangerous waltz across the marbled floors of power. His reign continues to stir timeless questions about authority, morality, and the very human flaws that can so easily infiltrate even the holiest of institutions. Remember this, as you drift further towards sleep. Beneath the gilded ceilings and solemn altars, the pages of history are rarely clean or simple. They are complicated, messy, and often far more entertaining than we dare to expect. You find yourself sinking gently into the folds of time, moving toward the dawn of the 17th century, a period shimmering with the grandeur of Baroque art, bursting with early scientific discoveries, and, yes, still populated by pontiffs whose legacies range from the sacred to the questionable. It is here that you meet Pope Urban VII, a man who occupies a peculiar niche in the annals of the Vatican. He holds an infamous record that no one has managed to surpass, the shortest papacy in all of history. Urban VII served as pope for only 13 days in the year 1590. Just 13. A mere blink of an eye in the centuries-long saga of the Catholic Church. Picture the weight of the papal throne resting on your shoulders for less than 2 weeks. And then, without warning, it is all over. Urban VII's ephemeral reign feels less like a chapter in history and more like a fleeting footnote, almost a historical hiccup that barely had time to register. Yet, despite its brevity, his time as pope carries significance, precisely because of what it reveals. It underscores the utter fragility of life and leadership during an age when even the most powerful figures were not protected from the cruel hand of fate. Urban died from malaria before he could even be crowned, before the incense of his inauguration could rise fully through the vaulted ceilings of the Vatican. His story shines a harsh and poetic light on how deeply human the papacy really was. Even in its most revered form. It reminds us that even men chosen to guide millions, dressed in robes of white and crowned with holy authority, were still at the mercy of something as mundane and merciless as a mosquito. Though his papacy was fleeting, Urban VII was far from unknown prior to ascending the throne of St. Peter. He was recognized for his stern and uncompromising moral views, a man of principle and structure. One of his most curious and memorable actions came before his death, when he issued a decree banning the smoking of tobacco in churches. Yes, that's right. Urban VII was responsible for what is considered the first official anti-smoking edict in recorded history. It may seem minor in the grand tapestry of papal decisions, but it offers an intriguing glimpse into his priorities. You might even chuckle at the image, a 16th-century cardinal mid-mass, caught sheepishly trying to put out a smoldering pipe while side-eyeing the decree nailed to the chapel wall. If only today's public health campaigns carried that kind of immediate clout within sacred spaces, scholars still debate the potential Urban VII held and how his leadership might have influenced the Church had he lived longer. Some suggest that his moral rigidity could have sparked meaningful reform across church discipline, a new wave of ethical enforcement during a time of internal decay. Others see his death not only as a personal tragedy but as a missed opportunity for a reformation of tone and structure, one that may have altered the course of a chaotic decade that followed, a period marked by less inspiring figures occupying the papal throne. The story of Urban VII offers a lens through which we can explore an often overlooked truth about papal history. Behind the majesty, behind the grandeur and the pageantry, the popes were profoundly human. They bled, they ached, they aged, and yes, they died. Sometimes quickly, sometimes cruelly. They were susceptible to disease, to exhaustion, to misfortune, and to the humbling randomness of nature. Urban VII's short-lived papacy serves as a quiet yet profound reminder of the vulnerability beneath the golden mitre. You may never have to shoulder the burden of leading the Catholic world, but you can certainly appreciate not having to do so while battling the chills and sweats of a mosquito-borne illness. And here is a quirky little historical footnote, one that tends to be overshadowed by more dramatic tales of the papacy. Urban VII's stance against tobacco, though often dismissed as a minor detail, remains a pioneering moment in the long history of public health awareness. Just imagine what might have happened if his papacy had not been so abruptly cut short. Perhaps the world's centuries-long romance with cigarettes would have ended before it ever truly began. A ripple in history that never had a chance to become a wave, so as your eyes begin to feel heavier and the world fades gently into the hush of night, consider this brief but poignant moment in papal history. 13 days of possibility. 13 days of potential that evaporated like morning mist. A papacy so short, yet still capable of whispering a powerful truth. Sometimes the most exalted figures are humbled by the smallest things, like a single mosquito in the night. Now you glide quietly into the early 18th century, a time when the papacy begins to veer into territory that can only be described as peculiar, if not downright baffling. At the heart of this strange chapter stands Pope Benedict XIII, who held the papal office from 1724 to 1730. His reign is not remembered for sweeping reforms or masterful diplomatic moves. Instead, it is defined by a curious blend of deep religious devotion and bewildering choices that often left his advisors in a state of quiet disbelief. Imagine, for a moment, a pope so consumed by spiritual pursuits that he practically abandoned the political responsibilities of his position. He spent his time immersed in prayer and mystical contemplation, while the daily affairs of the Vatican were left in the hands of others. It is not unlike appointing a CEO who chooses to meditate in solitude instead of managing a corporation, while the boardrooms slowly descend into disarray. Benedict XIII was widely known for his piety. His devotion to a life of spiritual purity was so absolute that he appeared indifferent to the grandeur, influence, and ceremonial prestige that came with the papal throne. His time as pope was colored by a kind of sacred eccentricity. There were rumors of him experiencing mystical visions and engaging in extended periods of fasting, silence, and night-long vigils. He seemed more monk than monarch, more mystic than manager. Historians continue to debate the true legacy of such a deeply spiritual papacy. Some argue that his unwavering commitment to religious life served as a stabilizing moral force, preserving a measure of integrity within the Church. Others contend that his neglect of governance allowed inefficiencies to fester and left the Vatican vulnerable to manipulation by less principled figures. The most striking feature of Benedict XIII's reign is the disorder that followed in the wake of his disinterest in politics. By stepping back from the affairs of state, he effectively handed over the reins of power to his inner circle. Chief among them was his secretary, a figure who, along with a coterie of opportunistic courtiers, came to wield disproportionate influence. This shift led to a period marked by blatant abuse of power. Nepotism was rampant. Promises were made and favors exchanged behind closed doors, all while Benedict remained cloistered in prayer. The paradox of his papacy is difficult to ignore. While he himself was personally virtuous, a man genuinely striving for holiness, the administration that functioned in his name became increasingly tainted by corruption and greed. It is a striking contradiction, the spiritual leader so focused on heaven that he failed to see the rot spreading at his feet. Think of it as the papal equivalent of a corporate leader so preoccupied with moral philosophy that the organization beneath him spirals into chaos. Adding another layer to his complex character is Benedict XIII's unusual fascination with relics and miracles. He demonstrated an intense interest in the physical remains of saints and in miraculous signs that pointed to divine intervention. On multiple occasions, he ordered the exhumation of bodies believed to belong to holy figures, hoping to find evidence of incorruptibility. In the context of medieval and early modern Catholicism, such findings were considered profound validations of sainthood. While this focus on relics may strike modern observers as bizarre or overly superstitious, at the time it reflected a widespread yearning for visible, tangible affirmations of faith. To Benedict, these relics were not simply bones or objects. They were spiritual anchors meant to inspire awe and reverence among believers. Yet even here, his actions sometimes backfired. Outsiders and skeptics viewed these efforts as strange, even grotesque, causing some to question the rationality of church leadership. Despite his many flaws and the administrative confusion that marked his tenure, Benedict XIII was not without meaningful contributions. One of the more overlooked aspects of his papacy was his quiet but consistent commitment to education and global missionary efforts. He gave strong support to the Jesuits, recognizing their value as educators and spiritual guides. He also encouraged Catholic missions across distant lands, particularly in Asia and the Americas. Through these efforts, he helped to extend the Church's presence and influence beyond Europe, sowing seeds of faith in places that would one day become centers of Catholic life. This delicate balance of otherworldly piety and real-world policy, however uneven, makes his papacy a compelling study in contrasts. He was both a mystic and a missionary sponsor, a figure who inspired devotion and frustration in equal measure. You might picture him now in a shadowed chapel tucked within the Vatican, kneeling before a worn altar, the air heavy with incense and candle smoke. The soft glow of flickering flames dances across his solemn features as he prays in silence, fasting as he contemplates the divine, all while just outside the sacred walls, the machinery of church politics spins wildly out of control. His papacy invites reflection on the nature of leadership, suggesting that sometimes leadership is not defined by strength or strategy, but by a quiet, unwavering sense of conviction. Yet such conviction, left unchecked by practical wisdom, can create its own form of disorder, as your eyelids begin to droop and the night wraps itself gently around your thoughts. Consider the quiet but intricate story of Benedict XIII. His chapter in papal history may not be filled with fireworks or thunderclaps, but it lingers, complex and unresolved. It is a subtle reminder that even those regarded as saints can leave behind legacies that are tangled, imperfect, and undeniably human. You drift now into the late 18th century, arriving in a period marked by immense upheaval and transformation, where the papacy itself was caught in a storm of historical forces far beyond its control. This is the era of Pope Pius VI, whose reign spanned from 1775 to 1799. A time when the very ground beneath the Church seemed to shift like massive tectonic plates, threatening to fracture the old world order. Across Europe, revolutionary ideas were spreading like wildfire, monarchies found themselves trembling on the edge of collapse, and the traditional structures of power were being challenged in ways that had never been seen before. In this turbulent context, Pius VI's papacy became a symbol of steadfast resistance against the rising tide of secularism, the Enlightenment, and the sweeping calls for political and social change. Yet, his time in office was not without its share of controversy and, if we are honest, some spectacular failures that shaped the fate of the Church for decades to come. Pius VI is often remembered for his uncompromising opposition to the French Revolution, especially its vehement anti-clerical stance and efforts to strip the Church of its authority and privileges. He emerged as a defender of papal power, determined to uphold the spiritual and political influence of the Vatican against the revolutionary forces that sought to diminish it. However, his reign was also marked by the loss of vast territories and the gradual erosion of the Church's political standing in Europe. You can picture him as a beleaguered leader, clutching tightly to the symbolic keys of St. Peter, watching helplessly as armies marched through lands once firmly under papal control, while radical new ideologies clashed violently on every front. It is a sobering and almost tragic image. A pope caught painfully between the splendor of the past and the relentless, uncertain march toward a future that seemed to promise nothing but upheaval. One of the most dramatic and unforgettable events of Pius VI's papacy was his capture and imprisonment by the forces of the French Revolution in 1798. Taken forcibly from Rome, he was transported across the Alps to Valence in France, far from the city he had governed and the people he served. There, in exile and declining health, he lived out his final days, dying far from home and from the grandeur of the Vatican. His death in captivity marked a tragic and poignant end to a career that had once wielded immense spiritual and temporal power. Historians continue to debate the nature of his legacy. Was his rigid and unyielding stance against revolutionary change a courageous defense of the Church's rightful place? Or was it a stubborn refusal to adapt that ultimately hastened the Church's marginalization within a rapidly changing Europe? A somewhat curious fact about Pius VI is his enduring love for lavish art and grand architecture, even as his political power crumbled around him. During his reign, he commissioned magnificent works of art, including additions to the Vatican's renowned art collections and elaborate frescoes that adorned the sacred halls of the Church. He spent lavishly on these projects despite the mounting crises facing the papacy. Imagine the surreal contrast of this scene, a pope ordering expensive decorations and monumental works of art while foreign soldiers invaded Rome. And his own authority was under constant threat. It was a striking disconnect between the splendor he sought to uphold and the grim reality closing in on him. This lavish patronage reflected both a desire to preserve the Church's cultural grandeur and a certain detachment from the harsh political realities of his time. Another important yet less widely known aspect of Pius VI's papacy was his sincere attempt to reform the Church from within. He sought to address corruption among the clergy, encourage better education and discipline within the ranks of priests, and revitalize the spiritual mission of the Church. Despite these earnest efforts, the immense external pressures and political upheavals overshadowed his internal reforms. His reign encapsulates the difficult struggle of an institution desperately trying to preserve its traditions and identity in the face of revolutionary upheaval and relentless change. You probably would not survive a papal career marked by exile, humiliation, and the loss of once cherished power. Yet Pius VI's story stands as a powerful reminder of how leaders sometimes confront worlds that change faster than they can adapt. Picture the somber twilight of his life, fading away in a foreign prison, far from the city and throne he once commanded. It is a poignant and unforgettable end to a turbulent chapter in the long and complex history of the papacy. You ease gently forward into the early 19th century, stepping into a world of great upheaval and transformation, where the papacy faced some of its most extraordinary challenges under the rule of one of its most infamous leaders, Pope Pius VII. His reign, which lasted from 1800 to 1823, reads like a dramatic roller coaster ride through the turbulent era of the Napoleonic Wars, exile, and miraculous returns. You can almost hear the creaking of royal carriages rolling down cobblestone streets and the thunderous march of armies echoing across Europe, as Pius VII struggles to steer the Church through the treacherous and shifting tides of power that swirled between the papacy and the empire. Pius VII is best remembered for his deeply complicated and often fraught relationship with the formidable Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, there was a sense of cautious optimism and hope for cooperation between the Pope and the ambitious French leader, highlighted by the spectacular moment in 1804 when Pius VII crowned Napoleon as emperor. This was a lavish ceremony filled with grandeur, pomp, and political theater, designed to legitimize Napoleon's rule and reaffirm the Pope's spiritual authority. However, the initial harmony between these two powerful men quickly deteriorated. Napoleon's insatiable ambition and desire for control soon collided with the Pope's insistence on maintaining papal sovereignty. This conflict escalated to the point where Pius VII was taken prisoner by the very emperor he had crowned. From 1809 to 1814, the Pope was held captive in France, confined and stripped of his freedom, while the world beyond his prison walls was undergoing dramatic and irrevocable change. Historians continue to debate the legacy of Pius VII's steadfast resistance to Napoleon. Some view his unwavering stance as a courageous defense of the Church's independence and authority in an age when secular power threatened to swallow spiritual leadership whole. Others argue that his refusal to adapt or compromise may have hindered the Church's ability to modernize and navigate the rapidly changing political landscape. Regardless of the perspective, Pius VII's eventual release and triumphant return to Rome became an enduring symbol of resilience and restoration for the papacy. The story is filled with all the elements of a gripping drama: betrayal, captivity, and ultimate redemption, so much so that it feels as though it could have been lifted straight from the pages of a Hollywood script. A charming and somewhat unexpected detail from this chapter of papal history is the way Pius VII reportedly maintained his spirits during imprisonment. Despite his difficult circumstances, he kept his mind sharp and his resolve strong by playing chess with his guards. This vivid image, a pope quietly strategizing his next moves on a chessboard while confined and powerless, offers a surprising and humanizing glimpse into his resilience and endurance. It is remarkable to think that even amidst political chaos and personal hardship, moments of quiet pastime and mental challenge could still be found. In addition to his dramatic personal story, Pius VII made important contributions to the organization and stabilization of the Church. He was a key promoter of the Concordat of 1801, an agreement that re-established the Church's position and influence in France after the devastating upheavals of the Revolution. His papacy was a complex blend of diplomacy, religious dogma, and personal courage, navigating the difficult balance between tradition and change. As you listen and reflect on this period, imagine the heavy tiara pressing down on Pius VII's head, the echoing and deserted halls of the Vatican during his absence, and the outpouring of joyful cheers from the faithful when he finally returned to his seat in Rome. The story of Pius VII whispers a powerful message of endurance and tenacity, how faith and political power collide in the storms of history, shaping the course of nations and institutions alike. You slowly drift into the mid-19th century, arriving at a pivotal moment in papal history marked by the lengthy and tumultuous reign of Pope Pius IX. Holding the longest papacy of any pope, from 1846 to 1878, his era was nothing short of a maelstrom filled with revolutionary upheaval, intense political redefinition, and profound religious transformation. The story of Pius IX is one of soaring hopes and high expectations, only to be dashed repeatedly by harsh realities. His legacy is complex and layered, one that continues to spark passionate and heated debates among historians and scholars even in modern times. When Pius IX first ascended to the papal throne, there was an unmistakable wave of optimism surrounding his leadership. He was initially regarded as a liberal reformer, someone who might guide the Church into a new age of openness and progress. Early in his reign, he granted amnesties to political prisoners, supported the introduction of constitutional reforms, and opened the Vatican's doors wider than they had been in decades. Imagine the excitement of those early days, a pope who seemed to embrace modern ideas and reforms, giving hope to many who longed for change. Yet, this period of hopeful anticipation was tragically short-lived. The revolutionary waves of 1848 swept across Europe with great force, and even the city of Rome itself erupted into violent unrest. These events ultimately forced Pius IX to flee the city. Marking a dramatic turning point in his papacy and setting the stage for what was to come, what followed was a sharp retreat into conservatism and a strict, dogmatic rigidity. In reaction to the turmoil and challenges to his authority, Pius IX hardened his stance and began to emphasize the traditional powers and doctrines of the Church. One of the most significant and controversial acts of his reign was the formal definition of the doctrine of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870. This doctrine declared that the Pope is incapable of error when proclaiming doctrines of faith and morals under specific conditions. The move remains highly contentious and continues to provoke debate to this day. Was this declaration a necessary clarification meant to strengthen and unify the Church in difficult times? Or was it instead a stubborn and defensive grasp at absolute authority, further alienating the Church from modern society and even some of its own followers? Historians remain divided on this question, illustrating the deep complexities of his legacy. An intriguing and somewhat lighter anecdote from Pius IX's papacy involves his profound devotion to the miraculous image of Our Lady of Lourdes. During his time as Pope, the Marian apparitions at Lourdes in France gained worldwide fame, and Pius IX's embrace of these miracles seemed to provide a spiritual counterbalance to the political and social storms raging around him. For many Catholics, this devotion offered a much-needed refuge of hope and faith amid the chaos of the era. The political dimension of his reign was equally dramatic and deeply consequential. Pius IX witnessed the irreversible loss of the Papal States, the centuries-old territories that had served as the temporal domain of the popes. The newly unified Kingdom of Italy seized these lands, drastically shrinking the Pope's temporal power and reducing his role as a political ruler. Imagine watching the world around you change so profoundly and so swiftly that your centuries-old kingdom evaporates almost overnight. It is like owning a sprawling and majestic mansion, only to discover that your neighbors have purchased all the surrounding land and fenced you in, leaving you confined and isolated. Despite the overwhelming political and religious turmoil that marked his papacy, Pius IX was also known for his personal kindness, compassion, and charity. He demonstrated a deep devotion to the poor and the sick, often visiting hospitals and orphanages in person to offer comfort and support. This human and caring side of him stands in stark contrast to the public image of a pope who seemed stubbornly resistant to the modern world and its demands. As you sink deeper into sleep, allow yourself to think of Pius IX as a man caught in the difficult middle ground between two eras. His papacy serves as a poignant reflection of a church struggling to find its place in a rapidly changing world, torn between upholding ancient traditions and facing the pressures of progress. His story remains a powerful reminder of the ongoing tension between tradition and modernity that continues to shape religious institutions even today. Now, you find yourself slowly drifting into the twilight years of the 19th century, arriving at the papacy of Pope Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 to 1903. His time as pope stands as a fascinating and complex final act in this long parade of problematic and often controversial pontiffs. Leo XIII's reign is marked by a unique blend of intellectual vigor and political caution. He was the pope who made a genuine effort to bring the church into meaningful dialogue with the rapidly changing modern world, but this attempt was far from simple and did not come without stirring controversy. In fact, his papacy raised more questions than it answered, leaving a legacy full of both hope and uncertainty. Leo XIII is perhaps most famously remembered for his groundbreaking 1891 encyclical titled Rerum Novarum. This document addressed the emerging and urgent social issues of the time, focusing on the rights and duties of workers and employers during the dawn of industrial capitalism. It was the Church's first significant and serious attempt to speak directly to questions of social justice. The encyclical advocated strongly for the rights of workers to fair wages and humane working conditions while simultaneously condemning socialism, which it saw as a threat to social order. Picture the Pope stepping into the role of a moral referee, carefully trying to balance the explosive and often violent tensions unleashed by the rapidly industrializing world. To this day, historians continue to debate the true extent of Rerum Novarum's influence on later Catholic social teaching and even on broader modern political movements, but there is no denying that its impact was profound and far-reaching. A rather quirky and endearing tidbit about Leo XIII is that he was the very first pope to have his voice recorded. Though the recording itself is faint and sounds more like a mumble than a clear or powerful message, it stands as a tiny yet remarkable technological bridge connecting the medieval robes of the papacy to the modern era of media and communication. Can you imagine a 19th-century pope, dressed in full papal regalia, awkwardly leaning toward a bulky and unfamiliar phonograph machine to speak? The image is strangely charming and highlights the strange meeting of ancient tradition and new technology. Leo XIII was also deeply invested in philosophy, particularly in the revival of Thomism, the theological and philosophical system developed by St. Thomas Aquinas. He saw this revival as a way to intellectually reinforce church doctrine and engage with the questions of reason and faith in a way that would resonate with contemporary thinkers. His efforts in this area were sometimes viewed as a sincere attempt to intellectualize faith, making it more accessible and palatable to the modern mind. Yet, critics of his approach argued that this intellectual revival was more defensive than genuinely open, a way to hold the line against the tides of secularism rather than a true engagement with modern ideas. On the political front, Leo XIII faced the ongoing dilemma known as the Roman question, a bitter and unresolved standoff between the papacy and the newly unified Italian state regarding the loss of the Papal States. During his reign, Leo XIII famously referred to the Italian government as a usurper for taking control of these territories, yet he carefully avoided open confrontation. Instead, he chose a path of cautious diplomacy and prayer. This measured and restrained approach drew mixed reactions. Some praised him as a wise mediator seeking to preserve what remained of the Church's influence, while others criticized him for appearing as a passive bystander to the decline of the papacy's temporal power. As you listen to the slow, measured cadence of history fading gently into the quiet of the night, Leo XIII Papacy reminds you that even the most complex and controversial figures in history strive to reconcile their ancient traditions with an evolving and often challenging world. His reign leaves us with an enduring and profound question: is it truly possible for faith and modernity to coexist fully and peacefully without friction or conflict? You probably will not survive the endless twists and turns of papal history. But at least now you can rest, lulled by the tales of emperors, exiles, and eccentricities that have carried you through the ages. Thank you for coming along on this slow and sleepy journey through the lives of some of history's worst popes. Now, as the night deepens all around you, breathe out slowly and deliberately. Feel your eyelids grow heavier with each word fading softly into a gentle whisper. The candles of history burn low, their flickering light steady and calm. Let the shadows of the past dissolve quietly as your mind floats effortlessly on the calm currents of sleep. Wind down, and so, we close this chapter of restless reigns and turbulent times. The popes we have met tonight were deeply flawed and human, sometimes bewildering figures caught in the relentless currents of history. Their stories, tangled as they are with power, faith, ambition, and failure, remind us that even those who carry divine titles wrestle with very earthly struggles. Now, feel the tension of their dramas loosen and the loud echoes of their mistakes fade slowly into distant murmurs. Your breath slows naturally, your body softens completely. The ancient halls of the Vatican recede gently into a quiet twilight, where only soft and gentle whispers remain. Let your thoughts drift without effort, like leaves floating calmly on a still pond. There is no need to solve the riddles of history at this moment. Simply allow your mind to rest, carried gently and peacefully on the waves of this slow and soothing story. Soon, sleep will fold you in like a soft blanket of calm and quiet. When you awaken, the world will feel a little lighter and a little less burdened by the heavy weight of history's most troubled popes. Until then, rest well,